Greetings, Earthlings! It is everybody's favorite time here on League Unlocked because we got a special countdown episode as we continue counting down some of the best players of all time. This time it is junglers we are talking about. The man who sets up absolutely everything for his squad, getting his laners ahead, completely controlling the early game throughout different seasons and years. Something usually holds true, and that's the jungle position is usually near the top in terms of most important on any single roster. We will be looking at the 5 best of all time, but before we get to them, we've got to shout out the men who just narrowly missed out on making that top 5. They fall just short, but they are still absolutely all-time greats in their own right. And we've got to start with a man who's returning to the LCK in 2020. It is Cacao, former MVP of OGN. I mean, he's played around the Rift. He's played in a couple of different regions. Obviously, he went to Misfits, and he was on KT. He's played on IG, China, Korea, EU. He's played all over the place, but at one point in time, we were talking about him as the best jungler in the world, absolutely hyper-aggressive, and while he may not have had necessarily the success that you would have expected outside of that KT run where they did win an LCK title, he's individually still been an absolute stud and incredible to watch. Even on Misfits, when maybe he didn't quite live up to what you were expecting, you still had those flashes of brilliance. And by the way, there's absolutely going to be a theme on this list. You're going to see a whole lot of Lee Sin highlights, because to be one of the best junglers of all time, you pretty much have to be one of the best Lee Sins of all time. It is a skill set that you absolutely have to have in your champion pool and your tool belt, if you will. He's just, if you're not good at Lee Sin, then you're not the best jungler, because he is the epitome of showing off your mechanics. And one of the earliest Lee Sins, the man who coined the kick term, we're talking about Insec. He's not quite in the top 5, but if he's not in at least the conversation of greatest junglers of all time, you're absolutely doing something wrong. There's a reason this play is named after him. He was one of the first guys to be implementing it. Again, on KT, he even role swapped to the top lane, and he's still playing Lee Sin up there, still pulling off these kicks. But outside of OGN, people like to think that Insect just was washed up and never good outside of that. But on Starhorn, he was pretty incredible and had some fantastic plays, even at that, especially at that World Championship where they did get to the finals. Insect's, the reason he's not within that top 5 is, yes, the peak isn't quite there, and you weren't talking about him as a world-class jungler, or when you were, it was a shorter period of time. A quick shout-out, though, for him actually being able to bounce back and still be relevant in 2018 when they were playing in the EU Masters, and Origin came away with that title there. So, I mean, he did come back, and obviously that scene not quite at the same level, but Insect just outside of that top 5. The other guy we got to shout out to, another Lee Sin god, is Spirit, who, like Cacao, has played all over the place. We've seen him again in Korea, in China, and in EU. He played on Fnatic, and this is a guy who we've seen his absolute peak. Yeah, we're talking about him as a top 3 jungler on the entire planet, but he's also had some highly questionable plays. He had some moments on Afrika where you were kind of scratching your head thinking, what is Spirit doing in some of these plays? But he also has these brilliant plays. Again, it's more Lee Sin that we are seeing, but on a lot of his squads, he wasn't necessarily the featured carry or the main leader. Obviously, Samsung Blue was a pretty insanely stacked roster. Fnatic, you still had 3/5 of that 2015 roster. It was just Huni and Reignover that were no longer there. I will say on World Elite, when they went into the finals of IEM, he was one of the main reasons why, alongside GA and Mystic, who recently came. But Spirit was hard carrying a lot of those games, but again, he falls just short of that top 5 list. And when you're talking about top 5, obviously it is elite company, and you have to take into consideration things like innovation and setting the stage for what this position would be, and that is exactly what number 5 on our list did. We are talking about the old king of the jungle, Diamond Prox of Moscow 5 and Gambit. This is the guy who basically invented counter juggling. So you've probably heard of that. That is just something that you have to know how to do. It's not even really looked at as a skill set. You just have to be good at it now on the competitive scene. But when he started doing that early on, it was like, what the hell is this guy doing? He's in my jungle, stealing my camps. He loved playing. Obviously, the Shyvana, the Evelynn is something that he really brought into the fold. The Udyr, when nobody else was really playing it. Early days of League of Legends, it was without a doubt, he was not only just the best jungler in the world, but you were talking about him as the best player on the entire planet around Season 2 when he was completely popping off on a lot of these champions. And when Moscow 5 was one of, if not the best team in the world. The Evelynn pick, it wasn't even just him. Him and Alex each were both playing it on that M5 lineup. But Diamond Prox, yes, he might not have all the career accolades and team titles, individual awards that you're going to see on the rest of the members on this list. But for what he did in the early days of League of Legends, you have to shout him out and recognize. And the fact that he's maybe faded out of the LEC existence, hasn't been there for many years, but he's still fully relevant and still competing, or at least vying to compete at international tournaments, even though he went to the LCL, which is a much smaller region. He's still competing there, and we've gotten to see him on that international stage. So for a guy who's been playing since 2011, 2012, to still be relevant so many years later, that longevity is something that you have to shout out and acknowledge, and is another one of the big reasons why we're talking about him on number 5 on our list. Coming up after the break, though, the countdown continues, and yes, titles and accolades, they get you pretty far on this list, especially when you have so many. Hello friends, we have returned to League Unlocked for that oh so special episode as we count down the best junglers in the history of the game. And of all the player rankings, I feel like jungle might be the hardest one to narrow down to 5 players, because there's a lot to choose from, and there hasn't necessarily been as prolonged dominance as we've seen in some of the other roles where you have people like Faker and Rookie who have been just at the top for so many years. Uzi for AD carries, Mata for support. I mean, there's so many guys that you can just kind of look to and say, yeah, they've been at the very top for a very long time. And it's a little bit more difficult with junglers, especially when you're considering, what exactly are we taking into this list? It's longevity, titles, maybe individual performances, individual awards. And you can't punish someone for having a bad team the same way you can't punish someone for having a good team or an all-time great team, which is exactly what number 4 on our list had. It is Bengi from SKT, aka the right hand of God, Faker's best buddy, the Robin to the Batman of the greatest player in the history of League of Legends. And people love to just kind of ignore everything that Bengi did in his career because, well, he played with Faker, he played on stacked SKT rosters. Was he ever that good? And yes, throughout the majority of his career, there was rare times where you were talking about him as being the best jungler in the world or a top 2 or 3 jungler in the world. But there's no denying all the accolades that he has. He's right there with Faker, the only 3-time world champions. And when the games mattered the most, you know that Bengi was going to step up. Just think of how many times he came in, subbed in for Blank or whoever it was and said, all right, don't worry, I got this. I'll carry us to victory. And yeah, he did in a lot of these games. And people love to say, well, his mechanics were terrible. They weren't terrible. Maybe you're comparing him to some of the best players on the planet and he's slightly below them, but he still had some insane pop-off performances on champions. And the fact, 70% win rate on 6 different champions, and that's more than 10 plus games that he's played on these characters. And by the way, some of them were more than 80%. We're looking at you, Nunu. You know, that was one of his favorite picks to always run back to because he was the control jungler. He's not this carry jungler that's going to hard carry the game like we saw with someone like Cacao or even Spirit at times. He was the supportive jungler because his roster was absolutely insane with Faker and Bang and whoever was playing in the top lane at any given time. He didn't need to be the pop-off performer except when he's playing first time Nidalee in the semifinals of the World Championship. That one series alone against the Rocks Tigers, that might be the greatest two-game performance that I've ever seen on such a high-stakes stage of him just coming in, playing a champion he never plays. And then in Game 5 as well, he played the Lee Sin, which again, you have to be able to play at a high level to even be considered on this top 5 jungler list. But he absolutely saved SKT in that series, which is the best of all time. And I mean, he was incredibly consistent for 90% of his career. Yes, towards the end at times in 2016, and maybe even, not even really in 2015, just 2016, there was a meme that bengi was looking terrible, but that was really less than 10% of his overall career. There was an entire 3-year stretch, really, where he was incredibly consistent for SKT. The reason he just doesn't draw as much attention as a lot of the other junglers on this list is because he wasn't the go-to guy popping off on his squad, and we can't put that as a negative necessarily because of the roster that he was playing on. He filled his role to absolute perfection on SKT, playing that supportive style and just bumping up his laners. And he was a huge key cog as to why SKT was so dominant for so many years. bengi absolutely deserves to be on this list. He comes in at that number 4 spot. The number 3 member on our list, longevity and titles are a theme for number 4 and number 3, but this time we're going to the LPL. We're talking about clearlove, who, he's been around a long time in the LPL and early on in his career and really late as well. All he did was win LPL titles. He might not necessarily have that same level of international success, definitely not even close to the same level that we saw from bengi. He does have an MSI title under his belt where he won that head-to-head matchup against bengi and was huge for that EDG roster with his Evelynn pick. But I think he was featured more in a lot of these squads. And what people tend to forget, you see that third point there, IPL 5 champion. clearlove's been playing since Season 2 on that all-time great World Elite roster. Yes, he was named Troll at the time, probably because he was trolling quite a bit, but he's been around for a super long time, and to think that he was looked at as the best team in the world way back in Season 2, yes, he was far and away from the featured player on that World Elite roster when you had Messiah and Wei Zhao on it. Yes, they were the superstars of that squad, but he was so young at that point. He was still developing, and eventually he absolutely became a superstar on EDG. He hasn't made it top 4 at Worlds, but he is a 4-time quarterfinalist, and you saw that a career win percentage of north of 72 is absolutely disgusting, and he is one of the main reasons why the EDG and RNG rivalry is so incredible, and why it's so volatile. It's because you're either Team clearlove or you're Team Uzi, like it's Twilight in 2010. You can't be fans of both. You got to pick one side, and that's just because of the sustained excellence that we saw out of clearlove, and he's one of the main reasons why prior to 2018 it was a meme that Uzi could not win anything. He was forever the bridesmaid, always a runner-up within the LPL and even at international events, although clearlove had nothing to do with that. But he was constantly denying RNG and Uzi specifically titles because he's got 5 LPL ones under his belt. He has been an absolute force in the LPL, and yes, he's been subbed out more and more, not even really getting starts later on in his career, but even as retiring right now, if he were to, he would still go down as, well, we have him right now as 3rd on the all-time jungler list. He has had an absolutely incredible career. He has the accolades and titles to back it up. His peak, at times, he was absolutely the best jungler in the LPL for long stretches of multiple splits. And really, the only knock you can put to his resume is not internationally successful outside of that one MSI title. But come on, getting out of groups 4 times at Worlds is still not bad. I think pretty much any team from the West would be very happy if they were able to get those marks. So EDG Clearlove in at number 3. Coming up after the break, we hit the top 2. And what do you want to go with? Longevity or the highest peak of all time when it comes to a jungler? Ladies and gentlemen, we have returned to our lovely countdown here at our lovely digs, that is League on Lock, as we look at the greatest junglers in the history of the game. We have reached the top 2, and there's a lot of criteria, obviously, that's going to go into these lists. And 2 of the most important are career longevity and how good you were at your absolute peak, and both of these guys are completely defined by that criteria, and coming in that number 2 spot is the man who undoubtedly has the highest peaks of all time when it comes to jungling. It is your 2014 world champion, Dandy from Samsung White and Samsung Ozone, MVP. He, for less than 2 years probably, but a full year, year and a half, getting close to 2 full years, was without a doubt hands down the best jungler on the planet, and it wasn't even close. He was completely styling on people domestically and completely obliterating people internationally. That 2014 Worlds run remains to this day the most dominant World Championship win that we have ever seen. Yes, I'm talking about more than SKT in 2015, because just the absolute dominance that they went through this entire event. The only reason they lost the game was they were pretty much trolling against Team Solo Mid and probably wanted to throw a bone to North America. But Dandy and Mata as a duo, you got to give credit to both of them, completely revolutionized something that seems so trivial now, and that's just vision control. The opposing team, they just had no chance to do anything. They couldn't leave any of their lanes because somebody would be there waiting for them. They were completely starved of vision, and that's why Samsung White always got so many kills, because people would just walk into them and they would completely murder them. There's so many champions that this guy is known for, but again, at his peak, it was Rengar, Kha'Zix that he was just completely deleting people on. And I know, having him number 2, you might be thinking, you're on 2 sides of the coin here. Some people think Dandy is hands down the best jungler of all time. Some people think he shouldn't even be in the top 5. And the reason there's such a split decision here is because of that longevity. Pretty much everyone else on this list was relevant or at the world-class level for longer than Dandy. I mean, yes, when he went to Vici, people like to meme that he was absolute trash, but he was still very good on Vici Gaming. That team just had so many other issues. I think he was still actually world-class for a lot of 2015. Then you had the role swap to top lane. Things got very messy. But for almost 2 full years, he was at that world-class level, and I don't think there's ever been a bigger difference in terms of junglers when he was at his absolute peak, and that's why we're of the idea that he does deserve some recognition. He's that number 2 player, and he also has, we've talked about Diamond Procs, the innovation he had. Dandy had the same thing, just in terms of that vision control that we kind of talked about, and it was in part with Mata, but I mean, Dandy was still a key cog for that, and Mata got MVP of Worlds, but I mean, Dandy was maybe the best player throughout the entire event. So even though he doesn't necessarily have as many titles as some of the other guys, and his career, he wasn't at his peak for 7+ years, because remember, he did play in NA Academy on E United with Licorice, Zazel, Deathly, and GBM. And who would have thought that the 3 NA guys' career would actually be going the best a few years later? That's absolutely insane. But Dandy's peak, unmatched. That's why he comes in at number 2, which means, if you couldn't have figured it out, the best jungler of all time, in our humble opinion, is the old man himself from the LCK. We are talking about Score, who didn't even start his career as a jungler, which is why he also is probably the greatest role swap of all time, because his secondary role, he became the best in the world at it, which is absolutely insane. And we talked about peaks versus longevity. Well, Score, without a doubt, has the longevity there. He never really reached the absolute peak that we saw from Dandy, but you're probably talking 3 to 4 years straight where this guy never dipped below a top 3 jungler in the LCK and maybe a top 5 jungler in the world. I know the memes are there. Never won a world championship, never even really got super far at these international events. Thankfully, thank goodness, he did finally get an LCK title. He was so deserving of it, and he waited so long for it. His career is a bit of a tragedy just because, I mean, the 2016 finals, the 2 health smite where he loses the Baron and then they end up not going to Worlds at all from it. 2 health away from a perfect smite. They grab the Baron, they win that game. You're your first seed going to the World Championship. It wasn't meant to be for them though, but I mean, the fact that he has been spoken about as a terrific jungler for so many years. There's a reason he was chosen to represent at the Asian Games in 2018 when, think of all the fantastic junglers there were around then. You had Peanut, you had Ambition, who was a world champion at that point. You had all these other incredible junglers in the LCK, and they said, you know what, Score is probably the best one and the one that we are going to go with because the veteran leadership that he brings, the incredible smites that he's had throughout his career. Again, 2 hit points away. I'm just going to keep saying that one. Usually, he's an absolute machine when it comes to those smite steals. And, I mean, his mechanics have always been there because he used to be an AD carry. So he had some of the best mechanics as a jungler, and that's why Kindred has been one of his favorite picks throughout the entirety of his career because it probably feels like he's playing AD carry again, but there's really no other jungler on this list, whether it's honorable mentions or the other 4 guys within the top 5, that you can confidently say they were at the top or very near top of, yes, their region, but also the world rankings in terms of individual performances on their respective positions. Score for 4 years, since 2015 and beyond, he had been at the very top. You basically never said he's outside of top 3 in his role, which is absolutely insane. Not many players have done that, not just in terms of jungling, but any other position. The incredible consistency is there. And even when KT was having tons of issues, think of how many different rosters this guy has played with throughout the years, and it didn't matter who his solo lanes were, who his bottom lane was, he was always right there as one of the best junglers on the planet, and that is the main reason why Score comes in at number 1 on our list, even though he doesn't necessarily have the titles backing him up like some of the other players on this list. So show some respect to old man Score, and maybe he'll come back out of retirement. Maybe we'll be seeing him again on the LCK stage or somewhere else. Maybe someone in NA will throw money at him when he comes back out of retirement. Who knows? Someone who's been that great for so long. North America has thrown money at way worse players, but that's it for your jungle rankings, 5-1, and the honorable mentions. That's all the time today for League Unlocked. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. As always, we'll catch you next time.